Today, I'm making borscht. It's a dish that you see everywhere in Ukraine, Russia, and across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It's also a starting point to talk about shared history and painful conflict between two countries. Come join me as we learn more about Russia and Ukraine while making some soup for the soul. Borscht is eaten by millions across Slavic cultures in Central and Eastern Europe, but the modern form of the soup does have strong roots in Ukraine. The ancient word for borscht actually comes from the Slavic word for hogweed, which was historically the main ingredient in the soup. Over time, beets took over because they grew well in local climates and were also widely accessible. Many versions also developed across kitchens, including with beans, mushrooms, smoked meats, and even green borscht. Then during USSR times, borscht spread across Soviet lands and became a staple for the entire region, with many places adapting it to their own tastes. The version I'm making today is quite classic, with beets, potatoes, and cabbage. It is best enjoyed with sour cream and a lot of dill. Borscht is not only tasty, but it's also a helpful starting point to learn about what countries in Eastern Europe have in common, which is quite a bit. Modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus can all trace their roots back to Kievan Rus, which is a medieval state formed by Eastern Slavic traders in the 9th century. Kiev sat at the political and economic center of this because of its position in key trade routes between Northern Europe and Constantinople, becoming very rich off of the commerce. Kievan Rus started off as a loose federation of territories ruled by various princes. Then strong leaders like Vladimir the Great unified these tribes, converted to Christianity, and developed legal codes and the Cyrillic language. But over the centuries, succession disputes weakened the state, and the various principalities fought for control. Kievan Rus eventually fell apart when the Mongols invaded in the mid-13th century. The northeastern parts of Kievan Rus became tributaries of the Mongols' Golden Horde, while the southwestern parts fell under Lithuanian and then Polish rule. It is starting from here that much of what is modern-day Ukraine and modern-day Russia began to develop separately for hundreds of years. A lot of Ukraine was ruled by Lithuania and Poland during this time. These kingdoms were more accepting of local autonomy and also tolerant of different religious choices. So even though the leadership was centralized, the presence of regional councils and strong participation from nobility created a more pluralistic political system. It meant that a lot of Ukrainian nobility were able to keep their positions of power and wealth, even when they were not the dominant political figures. Lithuanians and Poles also had much greater political and cultural affinity for Europe, and that shifted the population towards the West. And because of this relative flexibility, Ukraine was able to maintain a lot of their identity and culture, even though they were technically subjugated peoples. Now let's learn a little bit more about Russia. So Russia traces its lineage directly back to Muscovy, one of the territories within Kievan Rus. Under Mongol influence, Muscovy, which later became known as Moscow, grew from a small town into a wealthy city. They had incredibly smart leaders that cooperated with the Golden Horde to gain more wealth and more influence. Eventually, they became powerful enough to break out from Mongol rule in the 15th century. The leaders of Muscovy then slowly conquered nearby territories and expanded their borders and laid the groundwork for what is modern-day Russia. In contrast to Lithuania and Poland, Muscovy was characterized by strong autocratic rule of a Tsar and a strong emphasis on obedience to create unity. This included control over the ruling class, but also over the population. Between the 1600s and the 1700s, Russia gradually conquered the areas that are modern-day Ukraine, taking control from different places like Poland, Austria, and even the Ottomans. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, Ukraine declared independence. But by 1921, most of Ukraine had been retaken by the USSR, although the western portion did go to Poland. When the USSR fell, Ukraine again declared independence in 1991. In December of that year, over 90% of Ukrainians voted yes to independence in a national referendum, and the country became recognized as a sovereign state. But even after its independence, Ukrainians remained divided on affinity for Russia versus Europe. They elected leaders that flip-flopped between the two sides. Then in 2013, President Yanukovych refused to sign a planned free trade agreement with the EU and sided with Russia, allegedly after Russia threatened sanctions and to cut off gas supplies. This led to the Euromaidan protests by those in the population that wanted closer links with Europe. It eventually spiraled into a national revolution against corruption and authoritarianism. Yanukovych was voted out and then eventually forced to flee to Russia in early 2014. Russia leveraged this event as a justification to annex Crimea, successfully taking the area in just a few weeks. And then at the same time, Russian-backed armed groups started a war for independence and reunification with Russia in the eastern regions of Donbas and Luhansk. Then in 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia likely miscalculated. They thought that Ukraine would collapse quickly since the Crimea offensive has succeeded so fast, and that the West would not intervene. But after 3.5 years, the fighting continues and no side has the clear advantage. Russia has much greater resources, but Ukraine has remained unified and supported by Western finances and military aid. There have been over 200,000 verified deaths in this war, but experts think that the actual death toll is likely much higher. Now that we've breezed through many centuries of Ukrainian and Russian history, let's talk a little bit more in depth about why this war has happened and why it's continued for so long. On the Ukrainian side, they are fighting for identity and independence. Russia's invasion ironically ended up uniting the country like it's never been united before. Many people were actually undecided on the country's relationship with Russia before the war. But since 2022, polls have consistently showed that as many as 90% of Ukrainians identify Ukraine as their only homeland. Many do not want to live under a Russia-style authoritarian system that doesn't have elections or political freedoms or a free press. Many that are older also remember Ukraine's painful history under the USSR, where millions died in famines because of the collectivization of farms and unrealistic food quotas. All of this combined creates a very strong will to remain independent at all costs. The Russian side is arguably more complex, and I also think sometimes undercovered. The greatest reason for Russia to fight this war is ideological. Russia believes that Ukraine and Russia are of one people, extending to the Kievan Rus state, and that Ukraine is rightfully a part of Russia. Muscovy, in its historical expansion, and then later the Russian Empire, both strove to reunify all Rus and be the center of the Slavic world. The current elite also want to rectify what they see as the greatest catastrophe in their history, which is the breakup of the USSR. In other words, Russia sees Ukraine's independence as a direct challenge to its great power status, but also a challenge to its core worldview. Then coming from a more tangible perspective, Russia has security concerns with NATO expanding to include Ukraine. Russia has lived under the fear that it would be encircled by the West and is scared of losing Ukraine as a buffer zone. This is a buffer zone both militarily and politically. There is the risk that NATO places forces or missiles close to the Russian border, but at the same time, there is also fear that Western-style democracy could spread into Russia. And as Ukraine has shifted more towards Europe, Russia has acted more and more aggressively. Food for thought. Although many were blindsided by the Russian-Ukraine war, it is not an isolated event. I would argue it's the latest episode in the long and slow unraveling of the Russian Empire, which began in 1917 and accelerated in 1991. It can also be interpreted as a clash between two different visions of what it means to be Slavic. One is imperial and centralized, and the other is pluralistic and democratic. But at its core, this war is also a war for memory. Modern nations define themselves by their origin stories. Kiev, Muscovy, and the medieval world of Kievan Rus live at the root of multiple identities. The victors of this war will influence how future generations understand Ukrainian identity, the legacy of Rus, and who has the historical legitimacy to claim that heritage. In that sense, the conflict is not just about territory and sovereignty in the present. It's a struggle over the meaning of the past and who will write the story of Eastern Europe moving forward. Do you think war is more often about the past or about the future? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. The recipe to make borscht is in the description. Please give it a try. If you find my content educational, please like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Thank you, and see you next time.